The will landed on the polished mahogany desk with a sound no louder than a sigh, yet it cleaved the silence in the cavernous office like a thunderclap. The single sheet of legal-sized paper, folded into thirds, seemed impossibly small and fragile against the vast, gleaming expanse that was the personal domain of Mr. Gerald Thompson, Chief Financial Officer of St. Jude's General Hospital. Sarah Jenkins watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands, clasped at her waist, were rock steady. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the sleepless chasm of the previous night, but no rehearsal could truly prepare her for the chilling stillness in the man's eyes as he picked up the paper. His fingernails were impeccably manicured. Of course they were. He unfolded it, his gaze, accustomed to scanning 100-page financial reports and multi-million-dollar contracts, swept over the simple, handwritten text. Sarah knew the words by heart. They were seared onto the back of her eyelids. Last will and testament of Sarah Ann Jenkins. Thompson's eyes flickered up to hers, a brief spark of confusion before returning to the page. He read the single, devastating clause. Upon my death, I direct that my entire estate, including my property located at 435 Oak Street, be liquidated immediately. 100% of the net proceeds shall be placed into a trust, hereby established for the sole purpose of funding the complete medical care, including the Stanton procedure surgical intervention, for pediatric patient Leo Martinez. Silence. The air conditioner hummed, a low, indifferent drone. Thompson placed the will back on the desk, aligning its edges perfectly with the corner of his leather blotter. He steepled his perfect fingers and looked at Sarah as if she were a particularly distasteful insect that had crawled onto his shoe. "What?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Is this?" "It's my will, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, her own voice surprisingly even. "Notarized this morning? A copy has been filed with my lawyer?" He stared at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his mask of serene corporate superiority cracked. A vein pulsed in his temple. "Are you insane?" he hissed, leaning forward. This is emotionally manipulative blackmail. This is an abhorrent, unprofessional stunt." "It's the only asset I have," Sarah replied, the words tasting like ash. "It's the only thing left to give. We cannot and will not be a party to this," he snarled, his voice rising. "This is a massive, unconscionable liability. I could have you fired. I will have you fired for this. Get this thing out of my office. Security." He jabbed a button on his intercom, his movements jerky with fury. But Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, a 48-year-old nurse in comfortable scrubs, a woman who had dedicated 25 years of her life to this very hospital. She met his rage with a profound, bone-deep weariness that was stronger than any anger he could muster. To understand the weight of that single sheet of paper, to grasp the sheer force of will that had propelled it onto that desk, one had to go back 3 agonizing weeks. Back to a time when hope was still a tangible thing, a promise whispered in the quiet, beeping halls of the pediatric cardiac ward. 3 weeks earlier, St. Jude's General had felt like a different universe. On the pediatric cardiac ward, a place more accustomed to hushed anxieties and forced smiles, a rare and genuine joy had erupted. The source was a 7-year-old boy, with eyes as bright as his future was uncertain, Leo Martinez. "See, Sarah?" Leo said, holding up his latest masterpiece. He was propped up in his bed, a tangle of wires connecting him to the monitors whose rhythmic beeps were the soundtrack of his life. "This is you, super nurse." Sarah leaned in, her face softening into a genuine smile. On the page, a stick figure with a wild mane of blonde hair and optimistic rendering of Sarah's sensible bun wore, a stethoscope, and a flowing red cape. She was delivering a mighty kick to a scribbled, multi-tentacled green monster labeled The Mean Beeps. "Oh, I love it, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice warm. "You gave me muscles and everything. I think the Mean Beeps monster is terrified." "He should be," Leo said with the solemn gravity only a 7-year-old can possess. This was their ritual. For the better part of 2 years, Sarah had been the constant in Leo's revolving door existence. She was the one who could change his IV without him flinching, the one who knew that he liked his juice with exactly 2 ice cubes, the one who could read him stories until the beeps on his monitor slowed to a steady, peaceful rhythm. She loved all her patients, but Leo had burrowed his way into a part of her heart she thought had long since been calloused over. He had hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a cruel lottery of birth that meant half his heart had never developed. He was living on borrowed time, kept alive by a series of palliative surgeries, and a spirit far bigger than his frail body. The door swished open, and Dr. Evans entered, his young face lit with a smile so bright it seemed to generate its own wattage. He was a brilliant pediatric cardiac surgeon, still brimming with the idealism his older colleagues had long since traded for pragmatism. He held a tablet in his hand, and he was practically vibrating with energy. He looked at Leo's mother, Maria, who was sitting in the corner, folding a small mountain of laundry. Maria was a wraith, a woman sculpted from exhaustion and fierce love. She worked 2 jobs-cleaning offices at night and waitressing on weekends, and spent every other waking moment here, by her son's side. "Maria," Dr. Evans began, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Maria looked up, her hands stilling. "Dr. Evans?" "The board. The hospital's charity board," he clarified, his smile widening. "They met this morning. I presented Leo's case again. I showed them the new data on the Stanton procedure. It's risky, it's expensive, but I told them he was the perfect candidate. I told them we could give him a real heart, a real life." He took a deep breath. "They approved it, Maria. They approved the funding. All of it." The air left the room. For a second, no one moved. Then, a ragged sob broke from Maria's lips. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Sarah rushed to her side, wrapping her in a firm hug as the years of pent-up fear and desperation poured out. Leo looked on, confused, until Dr. Evans knelt by his bed. "We're going to fix your heart, buddy," he said softly. "For good." Leo's bright eyes darted to his mother, then to Sarah. "Really?" "Really," Sarah whispered, her own eyes stinging with tears. She squeezed Maria's shoulder. "It was a miracle. A genuine, honest-to-God miracle in a place where they were in desperately short supply. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond these 4 walls, a future where the only beeps were from a video game, not a heart monitor. The hope lasted for exactly 8 days. It was shattered in Conference Room 3B, a soul-crushingly beige room that smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. It was a routine fiscal review, a mandatory meeting for all department heads and charge nurses. Sarah was there representing the pediatric ward, and Mr. Gerald Thompson was at the head of the table. Thompson was a man who seemed to have been assembled in a factory that produced corporate executives. His suit was tailored, his silver hair was perfect, and his eyes held the flat, emotionless sheen of polished granite. He spoke in a language of his own, a dialect of buzzwords and acronyms designed to obfuscate rather than clarify. He cleared his throat. "Moving on to Q3 budget reallocations," he announced, tapping on his tablet. "As you know, market volatility has impacted our endowment returns, necessitating a proactive recalibration of our discretionary spending. After a thorough risk assessment analysis, the Finance Committee has made the difficult but necessary decision to postpone all non-essential, high-cost elective procedures until the next fiscal year." A murmur went through the room. Dr. Evans, seated 2 chairs down from Sarah, stiffened. "Gerald," he said, his voice tight, "what do you define as high cost?" Thompson looked at him over the top of his half-moon glasses. "Any single-instance surgical expenditure projected to exceed $200,000. The number hung in the air. Dr. Evans stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "And elective? You can't possibly be classifying the Stanton procedure for the Martinez case as elective. It's life-saving." Thompson didn't flinch. "Dr. Evans, the procedure is prohibitively expensive, with an uncertain statistical outcome according to our actuarial tables. It represents, from a purely financial standpoint, an irresponsible risk in the current fiscal climate. It is the very definition of a high-cost, non-essential in that there are alternative, less costly management options procedure." "Alternative options? You mean palliative care? You mean sending him to hospice?" Dr. Toolmine of 20.com. Evans's voice was shaking with rage. "You're sentencing a 7-year-old boy to death to balance your budget." "The decision has been made," Thompson said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. He refused to look at Dr. Evans, instead addressing the room at large. "Our fiduciary duty is to the long-term viability of this institution. We cannot jeopardize the whole for the sake of one part." He didn't use Leo's name, he never used their names. They were cases, expenditures, statistical outcomes. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The beige walls of the conference room seemed to be closing in. the fragile, beautiful hope of the week before, had just been executed by spreadsheet. Breaking the news to Maria was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever had to do. She and Dr. Evans sat with her in the small, curtained-off family room, the cheerful mural of cartoon animals on the wall mocking them. They tried to be gentle, talking about appeals, about fighting it, about other options, but Maria was no fool. She had lived in this world of conditional hope for too long. She just stared at them, her face a mask of disbelief, turning slowly to stone. The tears didn't come. It was worse than tears. It was the death of a dream, and it left a void too deep for crying. "So, that's it?" she whispered. "They give it, and then they just take it away." From his room just down the hall, Leo must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He called out, his voice small. "Sarah? Is the Mean Beeps monster winning?" Sarah closed her eyes for a second, a wave of cold fury washing over her. She pushed it down, transforming it into something hard and sharp. She walked to his doorway, forcing a smile onto her face that felt like a grimace. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice a low, fierce promise. Super Nurse is just getting started. The fight began that night. Sarah's small apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, became a war room. The coffee table disappeared under stacks of paper, medical journals, hospital policy manuals, printouts of legal precedents. She and Maria, united in their new, desperate mission, embarked on the first leg of their grim journey, the appeal to the insurance company. It was a descent into a special kind of hell. Days blurred into a series of phone calls, each one a masterclass in institutional apathy. They were put on hold for hours, the same tinny, looping fragment of a Vivaldi concerto becoming a torture device. They were transferred from department to department, from a bored-sounding man named Dave in pre-authorizations to a condescending woman named Janice in patient advocacy, each transfer requiring them to start the entire story over from the beginning. They were fighting a faceless leviathan, an entity that existed only as a series of automated menus and robotic scripts. "I understand your frustration," the agents would say, their voices devoid of any actual understanding. "As per Policy 7, B, 4, after a week of this Sisyphean struggle, the final answer arrived not by phone, but by mail. A crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the insurance company's logo. Inside, a single sheet of paper, dense with impenetrable jargon, delivered the killing blow. While the patient's primary diagnosis of hypoplastic left heart syndrome is a covered condition, the specific surgical intervention proposed, the Stanton procedure, is currently classified by our Clinical Policy Review Board as experimental and investigational. This classification is based on the procedure not yet meeting the required 10-year longitudinal efficacy and outcome data threshold as mandated by Corporate Policy 7, B4. Therefore, the request for coverage is denied. Experimental. They were calling a procedure that Dr. Evans had performed successfully a dozen times experimental. Because of a 10-year rule, a bureaucratic technicality. It wasn't a no based on medicine. It was a no based on a clause written by lawyers to save money. Maria crumpled the letter in her fist, her face ashen. Sarah simply stared at the wall, the cold, hard reality of the system settling in her bones. It wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. The next wall she hit was closer to home. It was Brenda Riley, the charge nurse on her floor. Brenda had the pinched, perpetually disapproving face of someone who believed rules were more important than reasons. She cornered Sarah at the nurse's station, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said, her voice low. She gestured towards the phone in Sarah's hand. "I see you. You're spending hours on this Martinez case. You look exhausted. You made a med error yesterday. You caught it, thank God, but it happened." "I'm fine, Brenda," Sarah said, her jaw tight. "No, you're not," Brenda countered, her voice taking on a tone of patronizing concern. "You're getting too involved. It's unprofessional. We are nurses, Sarah, not social workers, not crusaders. Our job is to provide the best care we can within the established parameters. You can't save them all. And you're okay with that?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "We just watch a 7-year-old boy die because of a parameter?" "I'm okay with doing my job and not getting fired," Brenda said, her eyes like chips of ice. "Thompson's office is watching this. They're watching you. This emotional entanglement is going to burn you out, or worse, it's going to get you a pink slip for cause. I'm telling you this as your friend." It was a threat wrapped in the guise of advice. Sarah looked around. The other nurses were studiously focused on their charts, avoiding her gaze. She was on an island. Brenda finished her speech with a final twist of the knife. I'm putting a note in your file about the med error, and I'll have to write you up if I see you using hospital resources for personal matters again. Just follow the protocol, Sarah. It's easier for everyone. But Sarah couldn't. Easier was not an option. Steeling herself, she requested a formal meeting with Mr. Thompson. She spent 2 days preparing, assembling a binder filled with everything she could find: peer-reviewed articles on the Stanton procedure, letters of support from 3 other cardiologists, precedents from hospitals in other states that had successfully funded it. She even included a cost-benefit analysis that projected the long-term savings of a successful surgery versus a lifetime of palliative care. She walked into his office, a vast, climate-controlled space with a panoramic view of the city. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a king on his throne. She didn't plead or get emotional. She was a professional. She laid out her case calmly and logically, presenting the binder, walking him through the key points. He listened with a placid, infuriating smile, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. He leafed through her meticulously assembled binder, his eyes glancing at each page for a fraction of a second before turning to the next. He wasn't reading it, he was placating her. When she finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, which sighed in protest. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your passion is noted. It is truly a credit to the nursing profession." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "However," he continued, "as I believe I explained before, the hospital is not a charity. We are a business. A non-profit business, yes, but a business nonetheless. To approve this one case, to make an exception, would set a dangerous precedent. It would open the floodgates. What happens next time? Or the time after that? Do we mortgage the hospital for every sad story that walks through our doors? Our primary obligation, our fiduciary duty, is to the long-term financial viability of this institution, which serves thousands of patients a year." "He's not a sad story, he's a child," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "He is one child," Thompson corrected her smoothly. "And my decision ensures that we will be here to care for the thousands who will come after him. I'm sorry, but my decision stands." He slid the binder back across the desk towards her. "I would suggest you and the family begin to explore the available palliative care options. They are, I'm told, quite compassionate." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He had dismissed her research, her professionalism, her plea. He had dismissed Leo's entire life as a sad story. Sarah walked out of that office feeling smaller and more powerless than she ever had in her life. The last resort was public begging. With Dr. Evans's quiet, off-the-record encouragement, Sarah helped Maria set up a GoFundMe page. She stayed up until 3 a.m., writing the text, trying to pour all of Maria's love and Leo's light into the words. She posted the best picture she had of him, one where he was laughing so hard his eyes were squeezed shut. The campaign launched. The first donations trickled in, 25 from a former patient's family, 50 from one of Maria's co-workers, 100 from a stranger who just wrote, "God bless." Each one felt like a tiny spark in an overwhelming darkness. After 2 weeks of sharing it relentlessly on social media, they had raised $18,742. It was a testament to human kindness, but it was a pittance against the 500, zero required. The number barely moved. Worse than the slow progress were the comments. Anonymous trolls, hiding behind their keyboards, descended like vultures. "This is a scam. Bet the mom just wants the money. If you can't afford kids, don't have them. Why is this my problem? Maybe listen to the hospital? They probably know what they're doing. The surgery is probably too risky and they're just trying to get money." The local news reporter, Mark Finley, called. He sounded bored, like he was ticking a box. He asked Maria a few cynical questions. "Has the hospital given you a reason in writing? Can you prove the surgery would even work?" And then ended the call with a non-committal. "We'll see if it's something we can follow up on." He never called back. The story wasn't juicy enough. It was just another of the 1,000 tragedies happening every day. The hope from the GoFundMe, once a small flame, had been extinguished. They were out of options. The system had won. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. The air on the ward was thick with a tension that had been building for days. Leo was weaker, his skin paler, his usual spark dimmed. Sarah was in his room, reading him a story about a dragon who learned to fly, when the monitor beside his bed suddenly shrieked. A long, piercing alarm. The number on the screen for his heart rate was plummeting. Bradycardia event. The world exploded into controlled chaos. Code Blue Pediatric Cardiac Room 204. Sarah's voice boomed over the intercom, calm and authoritative from years of training. The room filled with people. Nurses, residents, a respiratory therapist. Dr. Evans was there in a flash, his face a mask of intense focus. Orders were barked out. Pushing atropine? Get the crash cart ready. Bag him, I need a good seal. Sarah worked on instinct, her hands moving with an efficiency that belied the terror coiling in her gut. She was drawing up meds, calling out readings, her eyes locked on Leo's small, still form. Maria was flattened against the wall, a silent, horrified spectator to her own worst nightmare. They stabilized him. The frantic beeping slowed, returning to its steady if fragile rhythm. The team slowly dispersed, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of a battle won. But everyone knew it was just a battle, not the war. Dr. Evans pulled Sarah into the hallway, his shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "That was a warning shot, Sarah," he said, his voice ragged. "His heart is failing. It's compensating as hard as it can, but it's tired. We don't have months. We have weeks, maybe less." He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Thompson's office has already filed the paperwork. They're transferring him to Northwood Hospice at the end of the month. They're just waiting for a bed to open up. Hospice. The word was a final judgment. They weren't just denying him a chance to live, they were actively moving him to a place to die. That night, Sarah went home, but she couldn't rest. The tidy silence of her apartment felt suffocating. She walked from room to room, her hand trailing along the walls. This house. It was a modest, two-bedroom suburban home, but it was hers. She had bought it after her divorce, pouring every spare dollar and every ounce of her energy into its mortgage. It was her nest egg, her retirement plan, her fortress of solitude. The pale yellow walls of the kitchen were where she drank her morning coffee. The worn armchair in the living room was where she read until she fell asleep. The garden out back, full of stubborn but beautiful roses, was her therapy. This house was the sum of her life's work, a physical manifestation of her independence and security. She stood in her living room, staring at a framed photo on the mantelpiece. It was of her and her parents, both long gone. She had no husband, no children. This house was all she had. And Leo had nothing. An idea, monstrous and terrifying in its simplicity, began to form in the deepest, most desperate corner of her mind. It was insane. It was unthinkable. It was the act of a madwoman. But as she looked around at the solid, dependable walls of her home, she realized it was the only weapon she had left. The system was an impenetrable fortress of money and rules. You couldn't fight it with logic. You couldn't fight it with passion. You had to fight it with something it could understand, something it valued. An asset. She sat down at her kitchen table, the same place she paid her bills and wrote her grocery lists. She pulled out a legal pad and a pen. Her hand was shaking. She thought of Leo's smile, of Maria's hollowed-out eyes, of Thompson's smug, dismissive face. The shaking stopped. She began to write. The next morning, she found a small law office in a strip mall, sandwiched between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. The sign on the door said, "Notary Public, Legal Services." Inside, a harried-looking paralegal named Ms. Petrov looked up from her paperwork. Sarah placed the handwritten page on the desk. "I need to make this my official last will and testament," she said. Ms. Petrov read it. Her eyebrows shot up. She read it again, her mouth slightly agape. "Ma'am, are you okay? Are you of sound mind?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. "This is highly unusual. You're leaving your entire estate, your house, to a non-relative, for a medical trust?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Is someone forcing you to do this?" "No." "Are you planning on—" Ms. Petrov couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. "No," Sarah said, her voice flat. "I'm just out of other options." The paralegal hesitated, then seemed to decide it wasn't her place to argue. She typed the document into a formal template, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She printed it out. She pointed to the signature line. Sarah picked up the pen. The scratch it made on the thick paper sounded deafeningly loud. She signed her name, Sarah Ann Jenkins. Her own future, her security, her life's work, signed away in a single, fluid motion. Miss Petrov took the document, reviewed it, and then, with a heavy thud, pressed her notary stamp onto the page. The embossed seal was a final, irrevocable mark. Point of no return. Armed with a notarized copy, Sarah drove back to St. Jude's. She didn't go to the pediatric ward. She went straight to the executive suites on the top floor. She didn't have an appointment. She walked right past Mr. Thompson's aghast secretary, ignoring her protests. She entered his office without knocking, and that's when she placed the will on his desk. After his initial explosion of rage, after he called her a blackmailer and jabbed the button for security, he seemed to shrink. The fury in his eyes was replaced by something else: panic. He was a man who controlled everything through policies and spreadsheets, and here was something that didn't fit in any of his boxes. It was a human variable, messy and unpredictable, and it terrified him. "This is meaningless," he sputtered, trying to regain control. "The hospital will not accept this. It's coercion. I'll have our lawyers all over it." As he was shouting, the door he'd left ajar crept open a little wider. A young resident, Dr. Daniel Chen, had been waiting outside for his own scheduled meeting with Thompson. He was new, just a few months out of med school. He froze, his eyes wide, overhearing every venomous word. Sarah didn't engage. She didn't argue or defend herself. She had said everything she needed to say on that single sheet of paper. She looked at the man who held the power of life and death in his manicured hands, and she felt a strange, hollow pity for him. She turned, leaving the will on his desk like a lit stick of dynamite, and walked out. Her head was high, her back straight. She passed the stunned Dr. Chen in the hallway without a word. The story, however, did not stay in that room. Daniel Chen, shaken to his core, went down to the hospital cafeteria. He found a group of fellow residents and, in a hushed, shocked voice, told them what he had just witnessed. She gave him her will, her house, for that kid, Leo, and he called her a blackmailer. He called security. A story like that has its own life force. It escaped the confines of the cafeteria and began to travel through the hospital's nervous system. It was whispered in hallways, texted between nurses on break, discussed in hushed tones over pathology reports. It became an instant legend. The quiet, steady nurse from pediatrics who had gone to war with the front office. Brenda Riley heard the rumors and immediately tried to perform damage control. "It's unsubstantiated gossip," she announced loudly at the nurse's station. "Sarah is overwrought. We should all respect her privacy and stop spreading stories." But her attempt to quash it only fanned the flames, her defense of the administration confirming everyone's suspicions. The spark that lit the inferno came from the most unlikely of sources. Hector, a janitor who had been polishing the floor just down the hall from the cafeteria, had overheard Daniel Chen's story. Hector had been at St. Jude's for 30 years. His own grandson had been a patient on Sarah's ward a decade ago, and he'd never forgotten her kindness. Hector's cousin was Mark Finley, the jaded local news reporter who had dismissed the GoFundMe story weeks earlier. That evening, Hector made a call. "Mark," he said, "you're not going to believe this. Remember that kid I told you about? Well, his nurse. You gotta hear this." Finley listened, his cynicism slowly melting away, replaced by the electric thrill of a journalist who knows they have a career-defining story. This wasn't just another sob story. This was David versus Goliath. This was a story with a hero, a villain, and an act of sacrifice so profound it was almost unbelievable. He worked through the night. He got an off-the-record confirmation from a guilt-ridden and now cooperative Dr. Evans. He got a no comment from the hospital's PR department that was more damning than a confession. He wrote the story of his life. The next morning, it broke online. The headline was stark, simple, and devastating. Nurse writes will to fund patient surgery after hospital refuses. The story didn't just go viral, it went supernova. It was the lead story on every local news site, then it was picked up by the national networks. The link was shared tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of times on social media. Super Nurse Sarah started trending. The GoFundMe page, which had languished at $18,000, exploded. Donations poured in at a staggering rate: 100, 0, 200, 0, 400, 0, shooting past the 500, 0 goal in less than 6 hours. The public, baited for weeks by the slow, grinding injustice, was now unleashed. Their rage was a tidal wave. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with furious callers. Its social media pages were bombarded with thousands of comments denouncing Thompson and praising Sarah. Someone, possibly Daniel Chen, leaked a covert cell phone recording of Thompson's tirade against Sarah. The audio of him calling her a manipulative blackmailer was played on a loop on cable news. Mr. Gerald Thompson, the master of control, had lost it completely. The firestorm was raging, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Sarah was hiding. She'd turned off her phone, which had been buzzing itself off the hook since 6 a.m. News vans were parked down the street from her house. She sat in her quiet living room, the center of a hurricane, feeling numb. The money was there. Leo was safe. It should have felt like a victory, but it was all too big, too loud. Then, the landline rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered it anyway. "Sarah Jenkins?" a man's voice asked. It was her bank manager. He sounded stunned. "Sarah, I don't know how to tell you this. I've never seen anything like it. An anonymous wire transfer just came through our main branch. The instructions were very specific. Your entire remaining mortgage balance, it's been paid. In full." Sarah sank onto a chair, the receiver slick in her hand. "What?" she whispered. "It's done. You own your house. Free and clear," he said, his voice full of awe. "Whoever this person is, they also wanted me to pass along a message. It just says, heroes should have a safe place to come home to." Before she could even process this, the war was ending on another front. A lawyer from a major philanthropic foundation in New York, the kind of old money establishment that made Mr. Fland Thompson's authority look like a playground squabble called the hospital's legal department. A massive, 7-figure donation had been made directly to St. Jude's. It came with 2 legally binding, non-negotiable conditions. A sum of $600 was to be immediately allocated to fund the Stanton procedure for Leo Martinez and Dr. D.S. Al. Robert Evans was to be the lead surgeon. Any deviation would result in the entire donation being rescinded and a public lawsuit. Cornered, humiliated, and under siege from the board of directors, Thompson had no choice. He approved it. The surgery day was surreal. The hospital halls were buzzing with the story. Sarah took the day off, but she couldn't stay away. She sat in the surgical waiting room with Maria. They didn't talk much. They just held hands, their shared grip a lifeline in the terrifying expanse of the unknown. Dr. Evans, looking impossibly young and serious, had stopped by before scrubbing in. "We're going to bring him back to you," he'd promised. Hours crawled by. Every swing of the waiting room doors made their hearts leap. Finally, late in the afternoon, the doors opened, and Dr. Evans emerged. He was still in his scrubs, his mask dangling from his neck. He was exhausted, drained, but his eyes were shining. He walked towards them, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. "He's going to be okay," he said, his voice thick with relief. "His new heart is beating like a drum. The surgery was a complete success." The dam of tension broke. Sarah and Maria collapsed into each other's arms, their sobs no longer of fear or desperation, but of pure, unadulterated joy. In the weeks that followed, the dominoes fell. An internal investigation, spurred by overwhelming public and board pressure, led to Mr. Peepley, Gerald Thompson's forced resignation to pursue other opportunities. Brenda Riley, ostracized by colleagues who now saw her not as a rule follower but as a coward, was quietly transferred to a non-patient-facing administrative role in medical records. And St. Recordswe Albot, Jude's general, in a massive act of damage control and genuine change, announced the formation of the Leo Martinez Fund, a permanent, multi-million-dollar endowment to help underinsured families afford life-saving procedures. One rainy Tuesday, a month after the surgery, a simple, typed letter arrived in Sarah's mailbox. It had no return address. "Thank you. There was no one like you for my son, 20 years ago. His story did not have a happy ending. I have spent my life hoping I could somehow right that wrong for someone else. I'm glad there was a super nurse for this one." Sarah finally saw Leo on the day he was discharged. He was no longer pale. His cheeks had color, his eyes were bright, and he was wearing a superhero t-shirt instead of a hospital gown. He ran to Heron and threw his arms around her legs. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. She opened it. It was a new drawing. On one side stood Super Nurse, and on the other stood a new hero with a surgical mask, labeled Dr. Awesome. They were standing triumphantly over the crumpled green body of the Mean Beeps monster. and in the corner of the page, where the sun would be, Leo had drawn a small, cozy-looking house with a giant red heart floating above its chimney. Sarah went back to work the following Monday. The ward felt different. The air was lighter. She was no longer an island. As she stood at the nurse's station, a new family arrived, their faces etched with the familiar terror of the unknown. Their child, a small girl with wide, frightened eyes, clutched her father's leg. Sarah walked towards them. The system was still there, vast and flawed. The world was still full of injustice. But as she knelt down to meet the little girl's gaze, a warm, compassionate, and now utterly unbreakable smile lit up her face. She hadn't changed the world, but she had proven that one person, armed with nothing but their own humanity and a refusal to surrender, could carve out a miracle. And sometimes, a single miracle is enough to give everyone else hope.